So, previously, I was right in the middle of talking about fallen angels, and I ran out of time. So, I'm going to finish talking about the theory that they are fallen angels, mention the world soul, and then we can get into fairy hierarchy. So, I believe where I left off, we talked about the Reverend Robert Kirk, who was both a man of God and one who truly loved the fairy race, observed in his indispensable The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, that they are said to be of a middle mixture betwixt man and angel. By their very nature as spirits connected to earth, they are indeed closer to us than the cosmic energy of angels. But in the same work he also observed the great sadness that is an undeniable part of the nature of fairy, which is the shadow that lives alongside the light of their abundant joy. Some say that their continual sadness is because of their pendulous state, as uncertain what at the last revolution will become of them. By the last revolution he means the day of the last judgment, when it is said that the Sidhe are expecting salvation, at last able to return to their celestial origins at the end of days. Again, in the context of fairy beings as being spiritual forces of inner earth, this makes sense. As if life on earth did indeed end, they would return to the source. However, there are other possible interpretations. If we interpret that many omens of Judgment Day as being the herald of a new stage in our spiritual evolution, as opposed to an ending, then it may be that these prophecies in fact refer to a time when fairy will be seen again on the surface of the world. Returning to Evan Wentz's fairy faith in Celtic countries, there are several accounts that hint to this possibility, stating that before the consummation of the world, they will be seen as numerous as ever. Since these predictions are accompanied by similar biblical images such as the dead rising from the grave and angels being seen on earth, it is not a huge stretch of the imagination to suggest that instead of the dead literally crawling out of graves, no doubt to feed on our brains, if humanity's awareness were expanded, we would become more aware of all the invisible spiritual beings around us. This includes not only the ancestors, but fairy as well. On the deepest level, this refers to an awakening in humanity as a result of the awakening of the inner light of the planet itself. In John Matthews' fascinating contemporary account of fairy contact, the Sidhe, Wisdom from the Celtic Otherworld, he receives an insight from the Sidhe that hints at this very possibility. We believe that a new era may be about to dawn in which the people of the Sidhe will come forth again and be seen by all. Through examining the possible origin of fairy beings as fallen angels, we gain insight into not only fairy, but also ourselves as spiritual beings, and our relationship and connection to them. They, like us, are both of earth and stars. Like us, their spiritual origins are in the cosmos, and those of us on a spiritual path long for reconnection with the cosmic source of spirit, as do the fairy beings. They are our cousins in spirit. So, world soul. From Chaldean oracles, the nymphs of the fountains and all the water spirits in the depths of the earth and the air and the gleaming hollows are the lunar riders and the rulers of matter, celestial, starry, and that which is of the abyss. The ideas discussed here of fairy as being originally cosmic energy that now radiates from inner earth have direct and fascinating parallels with the ancient concept of the world soul, which exists in a number of ancient worldviews in slightly varying forms and still resonates today as a cosmic truth. The phrase world soul originates from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, but similar concepts that predate his writings can be found around the world in ancient Egypt, the beliefs of ancient Semitic tribes, Hindu teachings, and the Chaldean oracles. Mysterious fragments of a collection of writings thought to date back to ancient Babylon. I'm sorry. Where was I? These ancient philosophies essentially tell us that all living things are endued with spirit that radiates from one source at the center of the earth, which in turn was placed there by a creator god at the beginning of time. This world soul is usually referred to as female, and is the common origin of many wisdom goddesses throughout history, including the Judeo-Christian wisdom goddess, the Shekinah, whose presence in Christianity is better known as the Holy Spirit. The earliest origins of this wisdom goddess can be traced back to Sumerian myths of the goddess Inanna, some 4,000 years before the birth of Christianity. In a fascinating parallel to the tale of the fall of Lucifer, Inanna, also known as the Queen of Heaven, flees from her father's heavenly realm to bring wisdom to humanity. It is also extremely interesting to note that both Inanna and her Semitic equivalent, Astarte, are worshipped as the morning star, the title of the planet Venus, which is also associated with Lucifer. It is also interesting to note that Inanna and Astarte are both associated with a septagram that has in recent years been closely linked to Faery as the elven star. Later manifestations of the wisdom goddess, most notably the Gnostic Sophia, who strongly featured the theme of light that falls into the world to bring wisdom to the earthly realm. I will not dwell too long on this area, but will draw your attention to more interesting parallels for consideration that may deepen your understanding of the nature of Faery. As David Rainkine and Sarita D'Este point out in their excellent study, The Cosmic Shekinah, the Shekinah is the primordial light of creation, the heavenly glory of divine wisdom, and the inspiration for prophecy, and this certainly seems relevant to the exploration of Faery. Not only are they the links we have already discussed with fairies as being beings of the light in the inner realm, but there is an interesting connection again with the gift of prophecy, which, as previously discussed, is one of the most constant gifts of Faery, particularly the Fairy Queens. It is coincidental that the goddess Hecate, who in British folklore counts Fairy Queen among her many titles, is also a light-bringer, an ancient wisdom goddess. Hecate is worshipped as the world soul, as Hecate Sutera, which means savior. So this opens up a new area of study and contemplation. Another fascinating aspect of the Shekinah is that she is said to manifest as the Garden of Eden itself. This is another direct connection with Faery, for not only does their ageless realm resemble all descriptions of the perfection inherent in Eden, but a tale from Icelandic folklore tells that the fairy race were in fact the children of Eve, whom she hid from the eyes of God out of shame, who were then forever cursed by God to remain hidden from sight, gaining the name Huldafolk, or Hidden Folk. This has obvious similarities with the Celtic tales of fairies as fallen angels, and similarly compelling implications when we look at the spiritual truths behind the dogma. When we work with Faery and visit their realm, we are collaborating with agents of this primordial light in order to strengthen the much-needed link between their wisdom and our material world. If we perceive angels as the intermediaries between ourselves and the divine source above, it follows that fairy beings as fallen angels are the intermediaries between ourselves and the divine source below, or within the world of nature. In a parallel with the loss of the divine feminine through mainstream patriarchal religions, our ability to recognize the inherent spirit and wisdom in the world of nature has been weakened. This very light that dwells within the inner world and within the realm of Faery, as intermediaries, is the source of the same divine spark that dwells within each of us and within every living thing. Through this light, we are all connected. So, Faery hierarchy. When studying the fairy realm in any depth, it becomes apparent that beneath the seeming chaos, just as in nature, there is order. The hierarchy of Faery has not been as well documented as that of their upper world angelic counterparts, but fragments may be found throughout folklore, and through experience and interaction with a variety of fairy beings, a certain clear hierarchy emerges. There are, of course, the kings and queens of Faery, who are often associated with dominant features in the landscape, such as mountains or great hills. Below that, we have the lords and ladies, the gentry, or the trooping fairies, who, as their name suggests, could be considered the fairy nobility, though it is worth considering whether any of this is simply their way of trying to make themselves understood to humanity by mimicking our own social structures of the past. However, if we look at great shining beings such as a she, they are so different in power and ability from, for example, a dryad, that there is a definite hierarchical quality. This is not to say that even the most seemingly limited fairy being, elemental, or nature spirit should be underestimated. Within these lordly classes of fairy beings, there are many tribes and roles, and these vary from area to area. Sorry. I think I almost said areola. But as may be seen in tales and experiences around the world, yet there are always parallels to be found. For want of a better word, the lower classes of fairy beings are more accurately referred to as nature spirits, and below that the elementals of earth, air, fire, and water, or gnomes, sylphs, salamanders, and undines. The grimoire magicians of the Renaissance were well aware of the existence of a hierarchy within the fairy realm, and made good use of it within their work. From the 17th century Sloan, as quoted in David Rankine's Book of Treasure Spirits, I exercise, adjure, call upon, and earnestly require you, terrestrial spirits, that are the supreme head of the hierarchy of those that are called fairies, and who are called by the names of Mycob and Oberon, to command the seven sisters, Lilia, Rostilia, Phoca, Folia, Africa, Julia, Venula, and some one of them to appear visibly to us. They used very similar techniques to conjure fairy beings as they did to conjure demons and angels, primarily in order to locate buried treasure troves. Interestingly, though,
Instead of usual threatening behavior, fairy beings would be bribed with a good meal of a chicken or any kind of small joint or a piece of meat handsomely roasted. So it is clear that the magicians were aware that fairy beings could not be controlled in the usual methods, but must be appealed to instead. The author and teacher R.J. Stewart has been studying fairy tradition for over 30 years, and I asked him in a recent interview about his experience of fairy hierarchy. I have described it in several of my books, especially Earthlight, Power Within the Land, and The Well of Light. It's very easy to understand, because it starts with huge beings who are of, say, the Atlantic or the Pacific, or of the European landmass, so it's a total consciousness like that, which is what the Greeks would have called titans. Inside them you have lesser, but still very large beings that are of the mountains or forests. They're like a massive consciousness of the forest or the river. Then inside that you have somewhat smaller ones, like a mountain or region. Then eventually, just as in the human world, you get the smaller inhabitants who live in that region. The difference being that these are all consciousness. They're not just geography, they're consciousness. People, place, and power are 3 P's to remember. This is a fascinating way of looking at hierarchy within fairy, more like a Russian doll than a pyramid, with the smaller things being contained within the energies of the larger landscape spirits. Of course, this also works with the idea of the world soul, as all beings would then be contained within the greater planetary spirit. Yeah, we have time for this. So, unsteely, or the darker side of fairy. We remember the elves for their beauty and the way they move and forget what they were. We are like mice, saying, say what you like, cats have got real style. It is extremely important to understand when working towards connection with fairy and cooperation with their realm that not all fairy beings want to work with us. Most of us are lucky enough not to encounter directly negative attention from fairy, as most who do not wish to work with us simply wish to be left alone, and this wish should certainly be respected. Others amongst them may be termed unseelie, a term from Scottish fairy lore that translates as unholy, as opposed to their polarity, the seelie, or blessed court. Religious connotations aside, these are the beings whose solution to the problems of the world would be to simply get rid of humans if given the chance. An excellent portrayal of this in recent popular culture can be seen in the hit movie Hellboy 2, which also succeeds in making their viewpoint quite understandable. Scotland is not the only place to draw a clear distinction between the dark and the light courts of fairy. In the Nordic myths, there were light and dark elves, or Alfar and Svartalfar, who live in Alfheim and Svartalfheim, respectively. In South Africa, where there's a strong belief in fairy beings, they raise the beds of children from the floor to protect them from the dangerous Tokoloshe. Almost all the Slavic fairies are considered extremely malevolent, and Native American culture has its harmful spirits who also cause disease and famine. Indeed, most countries have their fairy races, and within them may always be found purely malicious beings. You will most likely not encounter these beings, but if you do, treat them with courtesy and respect, and do all you can to keep them at a distance. It is important to understand that they cannot be reasoned with. If necessary, iron may be used, but only as a last resort, and it will also drive away most other fairy beings. Bear in mind that this may offend them, and they have long memories. Truthfully, any fairy being is dangerous when crossed, to different extents, according to their natures. Who is to say that those we call unseelie do not have good reason to be, from some past betrayal? That is why it is so important to always be honorable in our dealings with all other worldly, and indeed this worldly, beings, for applying certain rules in some cases and not in others, or neglecting to live by our spiritual principles in daily life, does not a true and clear path make. So, 13 minutes, or actually 14 now. Next time we're going to talk about fairy etiquette and fairy beasts, and then we'll get into the ritual for this chapter. So I hope you enjoyed it. Bye!